Hi, this is the second part of session 1 of the presentation on the most common mental health disorders for adults. Before listening to this recording, you should have read and tried to answer the questions on the handout with the vignettes, which are meant to help you put into practice what you heard in the first part of session 1. In this video, I'm going to review with you those vignettes and the answers to those questions. Let's look at question number 1. What additional questions would you ask this client in order to be able to diagnose her? So supposedly we have been asking the client questions about her symptoms, and this information here in the vignette is what we got from her. I know you have already read the vignette, so let's look at it bit by bit to see what we have. Client reports feeling sad most days. Sadness indicates low mood, which is an indicator of a possible depressive disorder. She stays at home by herself most of the time. This indicates isolation, which is a common symptom of depression. It's good information to have. It tells us about the client's behaviors and functioning, but it's not a necessary criteria to give a diagnosis of depression. She cries almost daily and feels empty. This is kind of equivalent to low mood. It indicates low mood again, so it is not new or additional information. She feels inadequate. Inadequate is not one of the symptoms mentioned in the criteria there for MDD or for persistent depressive disorder, and oftentimes you'll find that the clients don't use the same words that the DSM-5 uses. So this would be a good opportunity to explore with the client what she means by feeling inadequate. So it might be that she has low self-esteem, or it might be that she feels worthless. So this would be a good question to ask. She has a hard time falling asleep and wakes up several times during the night. This indicates obviously difficulty sleeping, and this is one of the criteria. She says she has to force herself to eat. That's another of the criteria, appetite changes. So far we have 3 of the criteria, possibly 4, depending on what she means by inadequate, feeling inadequate. So what we need to ask is how long has she been feeling this way? When did these symptoms start? That will help us distinguish whether it is MDD or whether it is dysthymia. And we could also check to see if she has other symptoms that are not mentioned there, like difficulty concentrating or fatigue, psychomotor changes, and definitely suicidal ideation. Whenever there's a possibility of a depressive disorder, we need to find out about suicidal ideation. And just because the client hasn't mentioned any manic symptoms, we can't just assume that she's not experiencing them. This would also be a good question to ask. We need to rule out a possible bipolar disorder. So we need to find out about manic symptoms. Let's go to question number 2. What diagnosis would you give this client? So here we find the same client, is the same vignette but with some additional information, and I'm just going to go directly to the additional information. On the second line there it says she has lost interest in things she used to enjoy in the past, like meeting with friends. So this the loss of interest, the loss of pleasure is another criteria for MDD. And then it says, her body feels heavy. What does it mean? It means that she doesn't have the energy to move, even to walk. She is feeling very tired. Fatigue is also a criteria for MDD and for dysthymia. Then it clarifies here what she meant by inadequate. She feels inadequate and not good enough. That indicates low self-esteem. Then a bit further down it says she denies having suicidal ideation. And then she says, she claims she first felt depressed when her husband died 8 years ago. So 8 years ago is a long time. It could be dysthymia then. But there have been periods when she felt fine. So this indicates she hasn't been depressed constantly for 8 years. So it could be and maybe not. She reports experiencing difficulties with her daughter-in-law as she keeps client-son and grandson away from her. This has been going on for about 6 months and is the reason she's feeling depressed. Now we know that the trigger happened 6 months ago. This episode of depression has lasted 6 months, so we now know definitely that it's not dysthymia. So it could be MDD. Do we have enough criteria? Yes. With the 2 additional symptoms, the loss of interest and the fatigue, we now have 5 of the symptoms that are necessary to meet criteria. So the diagnosis would be MDD recurrent, because she has experienced several episodes of depression. Question number 3. What else should we be asking? What additional questions do we need to ask in this vignette? Client describes feeling sad. So sadness again is low mood. It indicates a depressive disorder. Not wanting to see anybody, again, it indicates isolation, which is not one of the criteria for depression. Having poor appetite, this is one of the criteria. So now we have 2 symptoms that are part of the criteria. Migraines. This is again common with depression, but is not one of the criteria. It doesn't help us diagnose in this case. And thoughts of death. This is very important and it is one of the criteria. And we need to clarify if he is having suicidal ideation. What does he mean by thoughts of death exactly? Is he thinking of hurting himself? Does he have an intention, a plan, the means? We need to be prepared to act and protect our client if needed. Then he claims he's not always like this. Sometimes he feels extremely happy. So this is an indication that we could be looking at a bipolar disorder. This indicates elevated mood, elation. During those times, he only needs to sleep 4 or 5 hours a day to feel rested. So this is another of the criteria, lower need for sleep. And then it says he's also able to do things faster than usual. So this indicates psychomotor agitation. which is another of the symptoms that we saw on the manic and hypomanic episodes. So we have 3 symptoms of depression and 3 symptoms of mania or hypomania. So since we are considering the possible bipolar disorder, we need to ask more questions to see if it meets criteria for a manic or a hypomanic episode. So the first thing we need to know is, does it have the first 2 symptoms that we had on the top section of the manic and hypomanic episode? The abnormally elevated mood, we already know that he has. So we need to ask, does he have increased goal-directed energy? If yes, then we need to ask about other symptoms from the lower section of that slide. We need to, sometimes it's not about asking, it's about observing, like the grandiosity. It's usually seen more than told. So we would also be checking for pressured speech, flight of ideas, what else? High risk activities, etc. And we should ask how long the episodes last in order to distinguish if it is a manic or a hypomanic episode. We need to know the duration. And depending on the answer, if we are considering a bipolar 2 diagnosis, we might need to find out more information about the depressive symptoms. Question number 4. What diagnosis would you give this client? Again, this is the same vignette as before, but we have some additional information here. So, all the way to where it says faster than usual is the same information as before. Then it says it tends to engage in several projects. He tends to engage in several projects at the same time. So that is an indication of a goal-directed energy. With that, we know that he meets the top 2 criteria for the manic or hypomanic episodes. During those episodes, he's more active sexually and sometimes forgets to use protection. This is telling us that he's taking unnecessary risks with possible negative consequences. So this is another of the symptoms on the lower part of that slide. This is another of the possible symptoms for the criteria. And then suddenly he crashes. That is what happened to him 3 weeks ago. So we know that he has been depressed for 3 weeks. These good episodes, as he describes them, typically last 6 days. So the high episodes last 6 days. What that tells us is that it's not a manic episode, it's a hypomanic episode. So it cannot be bipolar 1. Is it bipolar 2 though? In order to be bipolar 2, he needs to have had a major depressive episode. So do we see that here? No. Supposing that this encompasses all the symptoms that the client has had, we don't have enough symptoms for major depression. So we cannot give him a diagnosis of bipolar 2 either. So is it cyclothymic disorder then? Well, for cyclothymic disorder, he needs to have been depressed for at least 2 years. And here in the last sentence of this vignette, we see that he has had these ups and downs for about 18 months. So what this tells us is that it's not a cyclothymic disorder either. So he doesn't seem to fit in any of these most common bipolar disorders. What do we do then? So I've put this vignette specifically because this can happen in real time, in real life. I mean, oftentimes the symptoms that we gather from the client don't fit any of the most common disorders, and I wanted you to know that at the end of each section of each group of disorders, there are a couple of diagnoses that start with other specified or unspecified blah blah blah, that are for those cases in which they don't meet criteria. We know that they are from that group, but they don't meet the criteria for the common disorders. So we wouldn't try to force them to fit in a category where they don't fit. We would just give them one of these disorders at the end. Question number 5. What additional questions would you ask this client in order to be able to diagnose her? Client reports feeling hopeless. Hopeless in MDD is equivalent to low mood. However, in the DSM-5, in the dysthymia disorder, hopelessness is considered as a separate symptom than low mood. So I just wanted you to know that. Either way, this is an important symptom in both cases for MDD and for dysthymia. Then it says a client is feeling without energy. So lack of energy is another of the important symptoms, meets criteria. She says it takes her longer to accomplish things. That indicates slow movements. So it's psychomotor changes. And doesn't enjoy anymore things she used to like, such as reading and painting. This is loss of pleasure. So this indicates she meets 4 of the criteria for depression. She has been feeling this way for 8 weeks now and claims that before then she was feeling really good. So she's been depressed for 8 weeks, but before she was feeling really good. That indicates elevated mood. So she might be bipolar then. She was full of energy and was very active. This indicates that she was experiencing goal-directed energy. So now we know that she meets the top 2 criteria for the manic or hypomanic episode. But admits she was not able to finish some tasks since there were so many things she wanted to do. That indicates distractibility. She felt restless. That's another of the criteria. And admits she was a bit pushy and verbally aggressive with her family. This indicates irritated mood. For a few days, while she was feeling like this, she was only sleeping 5 hours a day. That's another of the criteria, lower need for sleep. So we do have enough criteria for a manic or a hypomanic episode, but which of the 2 is it? We need to ask about the duration, how long the client has been experiencing these symptoms. That's the first question that we need to ask in order to differentiate between a manic and a hypomanic episode. We can also ask about other symptoms that haven't been mentioned here or observed, like grandiosity again, or pressure speech or high risk activities, etc. And if we are considering that it might be bipolar 2, then we can ask about symptoms of depression, including suicidal ideation, because we only had 4 symptoms of depression, not enough for MDD. Let's go to question 6. What diagnosis would you give this client? Again, it's the same vignette, but with a bit more information. So the additional information here is that the client doesn't have current suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation. And then it says that she has difficulty concentrating. So that's one of the criteria for MDD. And with that, she has 5 of the symptoms that we need for MDD. And then at the bottom of the vignette, it says for about 10 days, while she was feeling like this, she was only sleeping 5 hours a day. So what is new there is the 10 days. We know now that she's had these high episodes for 10 days, which means that she was experiencing a manic episode. Mania is not hypomania. So is it bipolar 1 or is it bipolar 2? Because she also had enough criteria for MDD. Because she was experiencing a manic episode, we know it is bipolar 1. It doesn't matter if she had MDD or not. Whenever there is a full episode of mania, then it's bipolar 1. And with this, we're done with the vignettes, and we only have a few more short questions left. Question number 7. Can you give a client a diagnosis of bipolar 1 and a diagnosis of MDD at the same time? It wouldn't make sense to give those 2 diagnoses together, since the bipolar diagnosis already accounts for possible depression at times, including major depression. So the answer to this question is no. 8. Which of these symptoms are not seen in a manic episode? A. Delusion of grandeur. B. Elation. C. Pressure to speech. D. Disorientation. So the answer is D. Disorientation. Client may have this symptom. The client may feel disoriented, but it is not in the criteria for a manic episode. Question 9. Can a person have suicidal thoughts during a manic episode? Yes. It seems contradictory because we're talking about the client feeling elated or having expansive mood, but they don't always feel elated mood during a manic episode. Sometimes they just have irritable mood. And sometimes having all those racing thoughts and the excess of energy, not being able to sleep, not being able to switch off their mind, becomes unbearable for them. And to get away from it all, they might consider committing suicide. So do you have to ask all your clients in a current manic episode about suicidal ideation? Not necessarily, but you certainly want to evaluate how the client is coping with his or her symptoms, and then use your professional judgment to decide whether you should ask about suicidal ideation or not. And the last question, number 10. Depression is A. an affective disorder, B. an organic disorder, C. a mood disorder, D. a dissociate disorder. And the answer is C. a mood disorder. Both the depressive disorder and the bipolar disorders are mood disorders. And with that, we end part 2 of session 1 on the most common mental health disorders.